let me introduce you to each of the panelists, and then I'll turn it over to them and to Rebecca Zorach, who will moderate the panel as well as present her own ideas. So Rebecca teaches and writes on the early modern European art, on early modern European art from the 15th through the 17th century, contemporary activist art, and art of the 1960s and 1970s. Her interests include print media, feminist and queer theory, theory of representation, and the multiple intersections of arts and politics. Recent articles have addressed Afrocobra's gender and family politics, and she's also currently completing a book on art and soul and the landscape of the Black arts movement in Chicago from the late 60s to the 70s. She also co-organizes the archive and oral history project, Never the Same. Trish Kelly is an associate professor of critical and cultural studies and assistant dean of the Faculty of Culture and Community at Emily Carr School of Art and Design. She has published on a range of topics, including minimal art and art and politics in Chicago in the 60s, U.S. print culture of the early 19th century, and the mapping strategies in contemporary art. Currently, she is working on a book project titled On Site: Art, Politics, and Viewers, New York circa 1970, which is exploring the possibilities for critical engagement initiated through new modes of exhibition and display. And finally, Faheem Majeed is, as many of you know, Chicago-based. He is a resident of the South Shore neighborhood, and he often looks at the material makeup of his neighborhood and surrounding areas as an entry point to larger questions around civic-mindedness, community activism, and institutional racism. He worked as executive director and curator at the Southside Community Arts Center from 2005 to 2011, and he was the inaugural artist in residence at the University of Chicago's Arts and Public Life, the Manna Contemporary in Chicago, and the Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events. He was on the faculty of UIC until in the School of Art and Art History just until last year. So without further ado, let's welcome our panelists. Thanks.
So thank you, Jackie, and thank you all for coming. We're each going to talk briefly about a few images that we'll show on the screen, and then we'll try to have a kind of informal, free-form discussion, followed by some questions from audience members. So I'll start. This is an image that I know Faheem is also going to talk about, so I'm going to be brief with it, but I think it kind of encapsulates some of the kinds of issues that we'll be talking about. This is a silkscreen, multi-screen, multicolor silkscreen print by Barbara Joan Togu, who's a Chicago artist, African-American artist who was a founding member of the collective Afrocobra, and was one of the artists who worked on the Wall of Respect, which is something that I'm going to say a little bit about, and I think Faheem will as well. So this is an image that's kind of associated with ideas of protest, Black Power, the raised fist, right? And the idea of unity, so this slogan that appears over and over again in the image, unite. It's a kind of turning point in Joan Togu's work, where she moved from imagery she had a series of prints called the America series that was highly critical of American society and American power structures and hierarchies. And this was a sort of turning point where there's still definitely a critique, but she's moving toward imagery that's more kind of directed toward an African-American audience than as a kind of critique of society at large, and is about positive images. There's a sort of idea of positive images that came to the fore in the late 1960s in the Black arts movement that she was part of, that's about kind of uplift and kind of addressing Black communities with imagery that helps to see a future of strength associated with Black power. It sees a future of strength and unity and kind of caring for one another. And I think that this is the sort of moment of a shift in her work from the kind of critique to the idea of the positive image. So it's still about protests, but it's also about community building. And I think that's one kind of question that arises in political art. Often it's this sort of issue of, there are a lot of different kinds of questions that arise that I think we're going to talk about, but the question of whether it's about critique or whether it's about kind of building something different, building a new society or tearing down the old. So I think this is an image that is kind of at a hinge on that question. And this is another piece that this was also by Joan Togu, and I brought it because it relates very specifically to this kind of famous moment in Chicago, which was the Democratic National Convention of 1968. And some of Trish's artworks that she's going to talk about relate specifically to that moment as well. So you can see the text to the right says resist law. It says 1968. You have to kind of jump over the 1968. Resist law and order in a sick society. So this is in the vein of critique, right? This is a critique of society as it is, thinking about the kind of policing of protests with the tank up above, and the figures with guns, and the swastika, right? And then this sort of idea of resistance. Also with a sense of coming together and unity on the part of oppressed people. So the figures, the figures in purple in the middle with the kind of orange sky above them are very similar to the figures in the Unite print, right? It's a group of African American men who are coming together to make a show of unity and power. But the swastika is something that was very prevalent in her America prints as well, and that she associated really strongly with racial injustice in America. And I think it's something kind of interesting for us to think about in this political moment when we have a kind of rise of really aggressive and visually assertive white supremacists in various sectors, where the swastika is, and other kinds of images are actually being reclaimed from the right. This is an image where she's associating it with society, with the sort of structures of society as they were in 1968 in America. So that's another sort of set of things to think about. And then I mentioned the Wall of Respect, and I think a lot about Barbara Joan Togu in relation to the Wall of Respect, and I have to kind of put in a plug for the exhibition that's now at the Cultural Center that I was involved in co-curating, which is a kind of a look at the Wall of Respect, which was painted in 1967. It's a mural, a very kind of visible, politically motivated mural on the south side of Chicago, that was a wall of Black heroes and heroines, and was very much in the vein of positive images, so images that can kind of serve as beacons to the impoverished, economically impoverished, not necessarily culturally impoverished community that surrounded it at 43rd and Langley, and that was a really big rallying point for all kinds of activity in the late 1960s in Chicago on the South Side. So Joan Togu was one of the artists who contributed to it, as was Billy Abernathy, a photographer. One of the great things about the Wall of Respect as a mural was that it not only was photographed by many photographers, but it incorporated photography into the mural. So painters and photographers worked together, which is really, I think, unusual and interesting aspect of the mural. And it allowed for different kinds of kind of orders of imagery. So you had portrait figures that are the figures of the heroes and heroines, but then you also had different kinds of images that were able to be present in the photographs, including community members who were not necessarily famous heroic figures, but were representing various different kind of symbolic aspects of cultural production or religion or politics or other kinds of realms of realms of achievement that the wall represented. So Billy Abernathy was one of the photographers who was involved, who took many photos of the wall, but also contributed photographs to the wall. This is an image that I chose because it's in the Art Institute's collection, not because it was on the Wall of Respect, but it was part of a book that he did with Amiri Baraka called In Our Terribleness in 1970, which was another kind of mode of representing the Black community in that time period, and kind of it was a kind of a very political, but also kind of a very political set of poems and images, but also kind of a love poem to the Black community. And so this is sort of an aspect that I, kind of want to bring in too. There's the when we think about art and activism, there's the element of protest, but then there's also the element of community building that I think shows up in a lot of these kinds of images. And I think this is one that's a very loving portrait of these two young men, and it's sort of represents another way of being political, I think, that we could also think about in the present. And then I'll just say a little bit about the Picasso, and this is what you're seeing on the left is the maquette of the Chicago Picasso, which is in the collection of the Art Institute. So again, a rationale for bringing it in. But the other photo is a news photograph of young education activists. They were high school students in I think 1970, who are performing a protest outside in front of the Chicago Picasso, the actual monumental sculpture in Daley Plaza. One of the things so there are many things that are interesting to me about the Chicago Picasso. It was, and it's interesting to put it in relation to the Wall of Respect, something that Gwendolyn Brooks already did when she wrote two dedication poems, one for each of these works, the Wall and the Picasso. But they were inaugurated in the same month of the same year, August of 1967, and they're kind of serving as kind of opposite points in a way of public art in Chicago. So one collective on the South Side for a neighborhood, and the other, this sort of famous, great artist. Not to say that Picasso wasn't a great artist, but that he sort of epitomizes the great artist in that moment in 1967, and a kind of top-down, city-imposed project, as opposed to a kind of bottom-up, grassroots kind of project. But they happen in the same month, I think, is interesting. And the sculpture, the Chicago Picasso, quickly became, partly because of its location, largely because of its location, but also because I think it had a kind of aesthetic appeal that allowed protest movements to kind of become picturesque and get the attention of news cameras. It became a site for protest, and a lot of protesters very consciously staged protests in front of it. And I think you can see with this particular photo on the right, the way they staged it absolutely in a direct line in front of the sculpture in order to attract attention from news cameras. What they're doing is actually, they're on a kind of mocked up casket that says Board of Ed on it, and they're stomping on the Board of Education as a protest that African American history is not being taught in public schools. It was partly organized by people with a background in theater. So they're very, although they were high school students, they were very canny about how they staged their protest imagery, which I think is something that is interesting today about the ways that protesters are and activists are using the camera now, in the age where everyone has a cell phone and can take photos and circulate them readily on social media. I think the imagery of protest has become particularly interesting. Again, maybe it's always been interesting, but it's something that is much more available now than it was for a long time. And finally, I just wanted to make a nod to these photos, some of which, and I didn't necessarily pick ones that are up in the Provoke exhibition, but they're I think some of them are from this collection of, which is here in the Art Institute, of 500 photographs of the protest against the construction of Narita Airport in the late 60s and early 70s. And these are interesting, I think. They're interesting in a lot of different ways. These two in particular, I think, are very visually interesting, very beautiful photographs. They're not necessarily all beautiful photographs as photographs, but there are a number of things that are interesting about them. They're anonymous, so they were made. We don't necessarily know if it was one photographer or many photographers, how many there were. The protests themselves were a large collective effort involving farmers whose land was being threatened by the construction of the airport, and activists who came from elsewhere to help try to thwart the building of the airport. And it's something that, I've traveled through Narita Airport and I didn't know anything about this, and I thought, oh, this is a really nice airport. But it's kind of, to me, looking at these now, it's really reminiscent of what's gone on at Standing Rock and the effort to stop the pipeline, because a big project threatening a traditional connection to the land that people had, that people have, and one that is all about it's all about fossil fuel, right? Whether it's airports or pipelines, it's about it's about these kind of large-scale environmental crises that we're facing. So I think this is one of the ways in which this kind of imagery from the 1960s and 70s comes back as something to think about today. But also just thinking about the kind of response to the situation at Standing Rock and the response to the Dakota Access Pipeline is the quantity of art that was produced as part of that protest. Where does it belong? Does it belong in the Art Institute eventually, or does it belong in another kind of museum or archive? The question of kind of the collectability of art that's produced as part of a protest movement, I think, is another question that we might think about. So then I'll pass, you have your own mic, so I will pass the clicker to Trish to pick up.
Great. I'll just go through these, Rebecca.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. So just to be sort of truth in advertising, my research is focused more on the kinds of protest and activism possible in art institutions, specifically museums, commercial galleries, and art schools. That's certainly something I think a lot about right now as I teach in an art and design institution, and the ways in which, whether ephemeral protest or performance, photographs in different kind of print material, or actual objects that galleries collect may function and have a kind of livelihood in relation to political activism. Because often the activism and the moment of pressure is short and hopefully short, but the image lasts. And how does that become reactivated, restaged, rethought? So what I'm showing you here is a work by James Rosenquist, which was produced in 1968 as a part of a protest show in response to the 1968 Democratic National Convention. And even the fact that this work exists is interesting, as originally there was an artist boycott called of Chicago for 2 years, and Richard Feigen, a gallery dealer here in Chicago and New York, decided that would be really bad for business, so instead let's have a show. And so he invited all these artists, both in Chicago and New York, to send work. Much of that work, as you can see here, is concerned with the imagery of political leaders. So in this case, Richard Daley becomes the catalyst, as much of the work in the show did, LBJ, Richard Daley. But I think it's, again, that notion of parody or satire often plays into protest art, and is certainly something that Rosenquist and Barnett Newman as well was thinking about. Barnett Newman's Lace Curtain for Mayor Daley here at the Art Institute is another example of that. So in thinking about what are those possibilities for art activism, I also think a lot about exclusion. So here is a show set up that's full of name brand artists at the time in 1968, but how does that maybe avoid or exclude other kinds of voices or perspectives? And connected to the Feigen show were a lot of artists. First of all, there was no artist of color and no female artist engaged in the 52 artists that were in the Feigen show. So many galleries and art collectives in Chicago staged their own protest in connection to it, their own protest shows. So 10 what were called response exhibitions were established, including one that had the work of Ralph Arnold in that show. And Arnold's work is quite concerned with print ephemera, with photographs, issues of his own African-American identity and his identity as a soldier in the Korean War, but also how that might play out in '68 in connection to ideas of atrocities and really a deep-rooted conflict around war. So these other protest exhibitions, these response exhibitions, became a place where what wasn't quite codified as commercial in the same kind of way as what was happening in Feigen's gallery could play out in other venues. And in those protest shows, there were not just contemporary artists, such as the work that you're looking at here, but also Kitty Kollwitz was shown, and many artists of the past who were known for their protest work. So again, how do you reinvigorate that image for a different moment? Because the pressures of that social moment are so great that something needs to happen, or there's some sort of outlet for that tension. Here's another work that was shown at the Richard Gray Gallery at the same time as part of the response exhibitions, a work by William Weegee. This was, Weegee had a very clear and connected response to what was happening in '67 and '68. In '67, he was the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and specifically part of a Dow Chemical sit-in. When Dow Chemical came to the campus to recruit students, he and many of his fellow students staged a protest, which was actually the first time that police went into a US campus during that volatile moment and were brutalized the student population, and many of that student population were actually kicked out of school because of it. So it really started that moment of political activism on campuses and the volatility of that. So Weegee's work, here again connecting to Daly, often parodied the relationship between military, pop culture, as well as images that frequently played with sexuality as a mechanism to think about that. The next few works I'm going to show you all come from a different series. So they're not from that '68 response exhibitions or that Feigen show. So they're not directly connecting to the 1968 Democratic National Convention, but it's aftermath. So these were 3 images I'll go through, this one by Saul LeWitt, which are concerned with how do you respond to a contemporary moment, but specifically as a way to both bring awareness to and raise funds for that political moment. So it's part of a series, a portfolio of 12 prints that were produced to raise money for the Chicago 7, and particularly their legal defense. So it went to the ACLU. And in it, as you look at the 12 prints, all of which are in the Art Institute's collection, you see that artists are really struggling with how do you respond to political crisis. So in this work here, where it's a Saul LeWitt, the title, Vertical Lines Not Touching Black, and it's from a series called Conspiracy, the artist is Witness. It's, in a sense, his signature style, but brought to bear, the particular politics of representation brought to bear on that activist moment. In the same portfolio, we also have a work by Nancy Spiro and Leon Golub, They Will Torture You, My Friend, and a very different kind of response to crisis. And the last one I'll just show is also in the series, Romare Bearden. So in thinking about art and activism, and specifically the moment I work on, the late '60s and early '70s, and the ways in which that work can, both at the time and maybe today, speak to processes of activism and protest, I'm really thinking about how do you keep that historical record vibrant? How does that work get shown, circulated? What kind of legacy does it have? And in a way, how do you also keep with it the tensions? Because often as an image circulates, it gets reduced to a very flat representation of a historical moment. So how do you keep the vibrancy of the various perspectives and positions contextualized within that image? That seems to me a really important important issue. And then also, what assumptions do we make about what protest art or activist art should look like? How does it speak to an audience? What are the mechanisms or media through which it operates? All of that seem particularly important. And in that way, I guess underlying my work is the real belief that culture is a place for defining and reimagining a broader political landscape. In a sense, art really becomes the means through which a culture articulates what it perceives and what enters its language. So in other words, it constructs what is possible. So in that way, I think it's not only important to resuscitate and think about these historical moments, but again, bring it to bear on our contemporary moment today. So in other words, what does this work from 68 or 71 have to tell us about the contemporary protest that's going on right now, say at the Whitney Biennial, specifically in relation to the painting done by Dana Schultz, which picks up on a photograph of Emmett Till. So I think those kind of questions really are incredibly important, specifically today, as Rebecca was saying, in connection to the politics of our contemporary moment. On to you, clicker.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm a sculptor, so I thought I'd approach this as a maker and a little bit of my history here. Anyone who knows me, I always start out with this image of the Southside Community Arts Center as a community that I often kind of go back to in thinking about like representation. And when I think of myself, I think in these terms of multiples. And also some of the images that Rebecca was pulling from, not only from the Art Institute, were also from the collection of the Southside Community Arts Center. So, you know, and if you haven't been there, you should definitely go down. 75 years old, and a lot of firsts happened in this space, and including the space that opened its doors to me 13, 15 years ago when I first came to Chicago. So similar to Charles White or Margaret Burroughs, Gordon Parks, who were young people looking for a little support, I also kind of found myself in this place. Over 7 years, I moved from artist in need to curator to executive director. And Afro-Cobra, in all respect, the Southside Community Arts Center had a big role in kind of, once again, fostering like a safe space for these ideas to develop. And as a part of that, as an organization that wasn't originally a collecting institution, it kind of became an institution that collected through people leaving things, donating things, and so forth. So in its collection, there are a number of Afro-Cobra works, and the ones that stick out to me most are the works by Barbara Joan Togu, who is also one of the few women members of the collective, and in my opinion, ends up almost, I mean, kind of like the strongest influence. So I thought maybe to think a little bit about this work as I was looking at it as its impact on my work. And here are some of the works in the Southside Community Arts Center's collection as well. And I want to say Rebecca was a big part of actually photographing these works and making them more visible back in 08 through a 08-68, once again making connections, and we spent some time photographing this. This is the Southside Community Arts Center, once again programming, making these works available to the community to kind of, once again, kind of tap into youth. But thinking about some of the design principles going back here, Afro-Cobra members early on were thinking about Kool-Aid colors. This idea of Kool-Aid, thinking about the clothing of the people in the streets, a way of kind of pulling people in with bright colors, and then kind of loading those images up with text once they got close. So in a lot of ways, I guess these things are very much connected to what's happening in the streets, how people are clothed. This is an image by Bob Crawford. As well, and it's a good example of like clothing that literally jumps off the bodies onto the walls and vice versa. So that looks like me, that feels like me, I want to get closer. It's a part of me, let me connect to that. So once again, going back to this piece, but thinking about this, my neighborhood now, and thinking about board ups. A lot of my work actually utilizes particle board. And whereas maybe people see particle board as a dilapidated type of thing that kind of boards up, or ruin porn, which is like highlighting things that are in decay. I actually see it a little bit like a chrysalis. So it's a material that I use a lot in a lot of my work. And as I was looking at some of these images, I started so this is a piece that I did that was at the MCA. Won't go too much into it, that's another lecture, but just thinking about value and the idea of moving something from one place to another and playing on that value. Particle board as an inexpensive material versus particle board as a painting. Another Barbara Joan Togu piece. Another one of my pieces. Also, when you start talking about Kool-Aid colors, you think about a way of marketing as a way of tapping into people, almost like advertisement. So I think about that in a way of thinking about like business, advertisement, pulling people in, and then the lack of that. So this is something as I'm moving through the streets, thinking about value and how it's displaced. In United, it's a lot of, work. So these were pieces that were in my solo show at the MCA. And lastly, once again, messages being really clear. And then color patterns, Kool-Aid. So this is a work that I'm working on now, a new series of work called Kool-Aid Particles. So once again, going back and thinking about the color schemes and maybe ways of leveraging that to think about having a painterly conversation with maybe something that's very common in my neighborhood and maybe opening it up to draw people in as well. But yeah, that's it. Thank you.
So one question I have is that, excuse me, is really about like why the 60s and 70s as a site of inspiration for artists now, and also of interest for scholars, or interest for activists in the present. Like, what is it? I'm on the one hand, I also feel the sort of the question of like how do you reanimate that moment? Sometimes it seems like it ends up becoming kind of this sort of deadened, like, okay, there was this kind of protest and now it's over, and you can romanticize it, but can we really learn anything from it? We were talking earlier before the panel actually started about some discussions among Wall of Respect artists that get kind of heated, and like there's a lot of energy and passion there, but it ends up kind of seeming sort of negative at times. And on the other hand, you don't necessarily want to present like a sanitized version of the past, because as activists and artists today are working through tensions of their own, it might be good to know that people worked through problems before, and it wasn't just kind of this easy process of I think the way that the way the civil rights movement, for example, sometimes gets presented in in middle school or high school is that there was this there were these heroes like Martin Luther King, and they won, and we have rights, and it's like having more of a sense of the struggle seems valuable, but also like, does it get too much into the details and too much into the sort of personal and negative and all that that kind of thing? So what are sort of ways of making these connections vital?
Being someone that used to fall asleep in art history. Well, I did. I just didn't have the attention span at the time. But then coming to Chicago and sitting in a center that was in the books that I used to fail tests on, and realizing as I was unemployed at the time, coming from Minneapolis, so I had the ability to sit around and have what I call an unofficial residency at the time, which basically meant I loitered. And the people who used to loiter with me were in their like, who else has the ability to sit around all day, make art, talk, and gossip, but like older, like retired, like like women and men who want to come back and relive their heyday. Like, at a space like the Southside Community Arts Center. So I had the ability to sit there and learn, and I began to understand that these were like really vibrant, those words were actually tapped into really powerful things that were so powerful, in fact, that they were documented, right? So it just kind of, it came alive for me in a certain sort of way, and then listening to all these conversations, people like Doug Williams, Howard Seals, who were former directors who kind of just lingered. The 60s were like potent. It was electric, and I could feel it kind of coming off of them. I mean, you know, it's like there's just so much going on, and I got so excited about it. And that excitement is infectious, and I think we're in a moment now that feels very similar. There are a lot of connections, the youth that are just kind of brazen and going out here like doing these things and just upset and angry, and it's like, I'm not gonna take it. And then you have this other kind of side that is like trying to work within it. So it's like you still kind of have these continuing things, whether it's Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin versus Malcolm. These things kind of come back. And I think youth are now tapping into that, and that energy is still alive. So you look back at it, those things that come up. And yeah, for me, I like those images, those Afro-Cobra images, whew, to be able to dig that out and find, when we found that stuff, I was like, oh my God. Like it couldn't do anything but penetrate you in a very deep sort of way. And I was just fortunate to be at one of the homes of that. So, yeah.
I think just to pick up on that idea of lived, you know, what feels prescient and lived, that's the link that I think you're looking for, Rebecca. And in terms of, you know, why do we go back to the late 60s as a moment? I mean, certainly for me, it's a moment, you know, right before I'm born, right? So it's like, you know, why do I have such an interest in that moment? Is it maybe an almost site of origin? I'm not sure, but I think it's because it seemed like something was possible. And we want that. We want to believe that something's possible, certainly today. So it's I think if you look at a historical, just a historical record, and you look at those moments that have something there that seems pressure-filled and ready to pop in some way, that they become really exciting to resuscitate and go back to and think about, specifically when we're in need of that kind of vitalization. But how do we make it lived? And that's something certainly as a historian, I think maybe for you, Faheem, it's different as a maker, right? But as a historian, I wonder, you know, the practices that I'm engaged in sometimes feel like they're romanticizing those objects as very staid and contained. And I feel, particularly as an educator, that a lot of the attention that I mean, so little of what I actually do is go back and look at that historical record, but it's much more about how I try to enliven it through whether pedagogical practices of teaching or, you know, curating, writing, finding new ways to bring a different voice forward, and, you know, and always feeling inadequate. I think that's the thing about working with objects in a historical sense. It's, you know, it's easy to flatten them, but it's really hard to make them super exciting for viewers, and to rebuild that sense of what an initial viewer might feel like, and the possibilities that work might hold. So it's a process, I think, and that's why we keep going back to them. And certainly why the Art Institute does. I mean, you know, you look at the programming that's done around any exhibition, it shows you that attempt, right? And sometimes we win and sometimes we don't, but I think that's the process.
Yeah, I think this sort of raises for me also the question that I sort of tried to allude to about the Narita photos and others. I think the news photo too, with the casket in front of the Picasso, is about like what gets collected where, and how, you know, what the function of an art museum is with respect to political histories, right? I mean, it's because it's always kind of selecting from the stream of of all the visual culture that's produced around a particular political moment. There's certain kinds of objects that are susceptible to being collected by an art museum, right? And then there are others that might, you know, a curator might make a case for including something, but it seems a little bit questionable whether it's really art, whether it really belongs in an art museum. And then there are others that just fall aside as not, you know, they may be visual culture, they may have been even produced by artists, but they don't wind up in the art museum. And then there's some of those things survive, and some of them survive in historical museums or in other kinds of archives or libraries. But but sort of like where those lines get drawn affects like what kinds of stories we can tell and how we can enliven things. I mean, on the one hand, I think, certainly like when I'm teaching students, if I can find an image that just like perfectly encapsulates a historical moment in terms of its politics and its aesthetics at the same time, that's like, wow, that's really great, and that's certainly kind of can enliven a moment. But a lot of times we're dealing with things that are more on one side or more on the other side. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that in terms of kind of both kind of where things wind up historically, materially, but also kind of what we then do with those different kinds of collections and different kinds of absences.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. And I think in that way, I feel like we're all cultural workers. So I don't produce culture, but I try to bring culture back to the fore, the vibrancy of discussion and debate. And so, again, so little of what we do is actually the looking at those objects. It's so much more about the conversations you have around them, the attempt to find what's missing, trying to resuscitate a debate, which was, really a hot debate in the late 1960s about can abstract art even be political? So to try to find the voice to bring that forward. And it's messy work. It's about collecting, it's not just what museums collect, it's how can we cajole, find, bring to the fore those little bits of paper artists have saved, or whatever personal archives, and use that as a way to broaden that debate. And even what you were talking about with the kind of the arguing about a moment, whether it's about the wall of respect or any other political moment, it's that argument that matters, even if it's sometimes hard to go through. But it's that the different perspectives. So to go back to, I think museums do one part of the job, but it's so, like any kind of archival process, it's so limited. So it's really the cultural workers that keep that vibrancy moving forward, so that, as you were implying, I think that students actually can be inspired by that, and people can use that as a pushing off point. It's just the belief that culture is always progressing, and we're participating. So I think that, I have my moments where, as somebody who works a lot in the 60s and 70s, I was mentioning this earlier, that I almost feel like some of my studio colleagues who are engaged in social practice, seem to think that politics and art is new for them. And so we'll have these real interesting debates about, where can we find that and how do we record it? But I think that, it's all about engagement, all of us working together to do that and bring it forward. Not to sound too Pollyanna about it, but.
And I also think, in having the collection, I think it seems like a lot of museums are like how to leverage or activate that thing, that object to do something. And I was joking about now we're taking like Duchamp's toilet and putting it back on the wall and peeing in it. It's like it's moving from the ready-made back into this kind of functional way of, like, it's functioning in a different sort of way and activating something different sort of way. And I, as also an instructor and a teacher, a lot of the students are trying to figure out, or trying to figure out how the work can do, how it can impact, how it can function in a different sort of way. So in a way that it's not even conscious. It's just something that I have to do something. And it's like we're in a moment where I have to leverage what I have access to and what I have control over to make an impact. And I don't know what to do, so I'm gonna make, and then I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna pull people in, and life is gonna happen. Thinking about the work that we're looking at, life happened around the wall. The wall was a beacon. Life happened. It's not so much that the work of producing it, it was what happened around it. And when I was curator at the Southside Community Arts Center, there was a moment when I came in with these ideas of how art functioned, and it was like, well, no one can go in the gallery unless, because we got to keep the artwork safe, so unless they're referencing the artwork. So no poetry ciphers in here because you guys bump the artwork. And if I come here and see a painting move, me and the director at the time, we're fighting. And then I realized, I got to a point and said, it doesn't matter if it's like life needs to happen around the work. Like it's a part of the conversation, it inspires that, and that's really important. So I feel like that's alive right now. You know, it's like it's everywhere. You look on social media, it's just image overload and production mode. So I think we're going to look back at this time as like in the way we're kind of feeling about the 60s, I think right now is going to be like one of the best decades, like for cultural production. Like we're in it now, so enjoy it. I mean, you know, it's rough, but you'll look back and say, oh, I remember back when you young, you don't know anything, you know, but we're in that mode right now. Like this is where it is.
That's really interesting. It makes me think of, I mean, the sort of question of cultural production in a time of crisis or a time of deep political urgency, right? That on the one, I mean, I'm thinking of a couple of things from the time period we've been talking about. One is Wadsworth Jarrell and Jay Jarrell, who are members of AfriCobra, founding members of AfriCobra, talking about, well, you know, we didn't want to go out. We were going out and marching and protests, but at a certain point we decided I think at one point Wadsworth says, you know, I decided I couldn't be nonviolent if I went to a protest, so I had to stay home, and because I would get in a fight with the cops if I went, and I didn't want to get in a fight with the cops, and so we made our protest as like making our family and making our work, and that we infused that sensibility into everything we did, but it wasn't about going out and marching. And then on the other hand, I think of Cartemquin film from, I think it's 1970 or 71, about students at the School of the Art Institute. It's called "What the Fuck Are These Red Squares?" And they're talking about, you know, how can you even go on making art in a, you know, when students are being gunned down by cops at Kent State, or, you know, the bombing of Cambodia or whatever. That there, you know, maybe there comes a time when you can't make art anymore and you have to be out in the streets. But at other times, it seems like art can be a form of engagement with the political. And I wonder if, do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I would actually say in not making art, you're making art. This professor said to me, he asked their students, like, well, do you have a political stance? And they said, well, I don't have a political stance. And he said, well, you do realize not having a political stance is a political stance. Like, so you have a political stance. Like, so in that sense, the way that's a creative, like that's a conscious decision to withhold something, which is, you know what I mean? So whether or not it's in production of making physical things or an action, there's a dialogue, conversation happening. And just going back, it's like, when things are too good, my best artwork comes when I'm stressed. When I'm back to the wall, like, you know, if things are too, like, that's why it's so, because times are so, like, it's just crazy right now. You know, it's just, people are tense. It's an outlet. So that's why, you know, like, yeah, who wants artwork when everything's like, I mean, you know, happy. Yeah, we all want to be happy. I get it. Yes, I want to be happy when I say, but I know my best work.
It's like Orson Welles in The Third Man saying, I think it's not Orson Welles who says it, but that what did the Swiss produce in 500 years of peace? The cuckoo clock. Meanwhile, in Italy, which was violent and
right. Yeah.
But I think it's also calling up, and we certainly as a historian, an art historian, you can forget this easily, but that it's not about an object, it's about a practice, and that artists are engaged in practice. And so that practice is not neat and tidy, but has all of these other aspects of it, whether happy, sad, or I'm going to go home and make dinner for my kids, and maybe that's art, I don't know, but it's certainly practice. So I think that it's, you know, when you work with collections, to go back full circle, it becomes hard to resuscitate that practice, but yet I think you can't really understand the work without it. So that's the rub.
So I can't see anything because of these lights. I'm not sure what time it is or whether, you know, how are we at the stage where we should be calling for audience questions? Yes? Okay. All right. Audience questions. I see one right there. I think a mic is
there
coming.
you go.
Well, why don't I
Johnny on the spot,
right here,
Michael.
yeah.
Johnny on the spot.
Okay. Hi, thanks for your lecture. Maybe I can sit down. I myself is an artist activist, and all of you were mentioning the history kind of resonating to the current situation. And by experiencing the political climate in Chicago and protest culture in Chicago and also South Korea, recently the president has been impeached through the public's mass-produced protest candlelight vigil. And I have been questioning the need of riots in any types of demonstration. Democratization movement was successful in South Korean modern history, and I believe that also existed in the United States as well. And I want to hear every panelist's opinion about that. So if the riot is needed. Yeah, in order to change the society. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Wow.
Okay, yeah. That's a great question. I think that mass movements. I mean, I guess what I would say is like I don't think riots necessarily. I don't think riots necessarily always have good outcomes, and I don't think they necessarily always have bad outcomes. But I think I would say that that for radical change to happen, you need mass movements of one kind or another, and the specific strategies might differ according to different places and times. So I wouldn't say necessarily you need riots, but I would say you need mass movements. You need many people refusing, putting themselves in the path of power, and saying enough. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
I would completely agree. I think that it's in a late capitalist moment, that riot may be as much connected to capital as it is to anything else, right? In terms of where the protest is possible. So I think it's, whether through social media, the opportunities afforded that, or through other kinds of activism, I think the riot is much more multivalent than it's ever been before. And so I think there's all sorts of activism that is needed and necessary. And as Rebecca was saying, each political moment and each specific cultural location, I think, calls for a different strategy. It's just, trying to be clear enough to understand that context to effectively work within it. And that's the difficulty, I think.
Burn it all down, that's what I say. No. Yeah, but no. So there's a moment when, who was it? It was Tupac that said that you have a very short window to be like brazen. Like there are no old activists. Like there was a moment I can remember where I was just like, balls to the walls. I don't care. I'm going in. I'm throwing books at people. My professor. Now I'm like a dad. It's like, it's kind of like, well, let me be a little like, well, there's consequence. You start going into that. So I want to say is like looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, everyone has a role. And the youth right now, they're just pissed. And they're going in and they're like shutting it down, right? And they're like, no, we're not happy. We're not going to sugarcoat anything. You're not going to take this over. And that's amazing. I don't know if I have that in me in that way, but I have a role in that. I have a role to provide some clarity in some other sort of ways, right? So I can't say if a riot, like as a strategic thing. My dad and he said, someone's going to get hurt. Who's going to clean up that mess? But, looking at the riots in Chicago after King died, and the Watts riots and everything, the LA riots, I mean, that was just, I don't think that's nothing you can control. That's just, boom. I mean, that happens. And that's a consequence of certain actions happening. And we haven't seen the last of our riots. It's part of, it goes on and on. It's like we keep doing the same things over and over. So this won't be the last horrible riot that we've seen. So I think it's part of a story, and it's a part of a condition that happens. But, people sometimes get hurt in riots, and I don't want anyone to get hurt as a father. But as a young person, I wouldn't want anyone to stand in my way, or I would fear for anyone who would stand in my way at that time. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I think the more logical, I'm with my, that's the more, thinking more like broadly about the role that everyone has to play. I think that's the way to go, but yeah.
I mean, I would just add, I think, putting one's body on the line, has to happen, right? It's like that, so but it's not necessarily riot in the sense of breaking windows, right? But shutting down Lakeshore Drive.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think I'm glad when that happens, right? Because I think I think that it, makes people aware of the kinds of injustice that are occurring. So, but in terms of what could a mass movement do to, to have radical social change in America? I'm skeptical about riot as the best strategy for that, but I'm not going to say it can't be a part of it.
That's a good question. Sure. Can you did the microphone right behind you? Yeah.
I'd be interested for the three of you to comment on some current artists that are involved in activism beyond simply documenting it. And I think there are a lot of people, especially filmmakers, who, they go out and document all these protests and Black Lives Matters and all the events, but then they haven't really made their art yet unless they can put it together in some useful way. And I was most interested in non-photographic artists that take time to create a work. And do you know of artists that are creating work and then using that as a way to stimulate activism and stimulate getting people involved? Or is their work, by the time it's finished, it goes in a museum and it sits there until 25 years later they say, what happened in the 2010, 2020s?
Well, I would love to know who the artists are that are able to make the work that can go into a museum right away. I've been trying to figure that out. The first one you said is easy. The second one is that's not that easy. I can list a couple. I'm sure we all have lists, but Colleen Smith, who's in the Whitney Biennial now, she's someone I truly admire. She's a filmmaker, and I think more than most. She's very successful, obviously very successful right now, but takes that with a grain of salt. And she's challenges and is brazen in what type of work she produces and willing to walk away from it all. It feels like I'm not going to be a part of this. I'll walk away and I'm going to use my work to leverage. So she's a brilliant artist, number one. Maria Gaspar, who has not only made work, but a little bit of performance, but also she's done things to challenge the presence of the prison over in California in her neighborhood of Little Village. And she works collectively. So in thinking about, and comes from a history of kind of mural making, right? A history of that's just deeply steeped in that. And, mother used to have a radio station, used to use the radio and things like that as a way of tapping into the community. So it's kind of ingrained in her, and she figures out now ways to kind of activate that. So yeah, there are a lot of individuals. I would actually say it's quite the reverse, that there are no artists that work in that vein. It actually makes it sometimes a little more challenging, even though right now that seems to be in vogue. Yeah, a lot of the artists that are doing the work now are not actually in the museums or the art market. And it's kind of really hard to make a living that way. So they're in the schools, because that's often the places where they're able to kind of finance the ability to make the work.
And I would say, actually, that's something that's kind of characteristic of Chicago, that that so many of the artists who are, who are able to do political work. I mean, there are a lot of artists who are able to do political work in Chicago who don't teach in art schools, but there's a kind of, because there's less of an art market here, or less of a kind of hypertrophied art market here, there's a lot of the opportunities for artists are as educators, and a lot of those educators are also activist artists, and that provides a platform for a lot of people to do work without having to worry so much about whether it can be collected and collected either by collectors or museums. But there's a lot of work happening in Chicago around prisons and police brutality, the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, and TAM's Year 10, which was about the TAM Supermax prison in downstate Illinois. And then there are artists who are involved in Black Lives Matter and different kind of movements associated with it that who are doing work who are doing work that's kind of instrumentalized as part of particular protests, but also is really creative in ways that are not so much necessarily representational, but about strategies for getting imagery out into the world or getting people to see things. So, like the Chicago Light Brigade, which puts lighted letters spelling out political slogans over overpasses for people to see, or like one of the things that was done by some of the artists in Chicago Torture Justice Memorials was mud stenciling, which is like a way of getting a message into public that then can wash away and isn't illegal because it's not about making a permanent mark on a wall or a sidewalk. And kind of just thinking through like those kinds of strategies, I think is a great vehicle for the creativity of artists, but then it's not necessarily producing something that can be collected.
I think to pick up on that as well, it's really about the education, but I mean education very broadly defined. And so I think, coming from a Vancouver context where there's, the real political protest in art right now is coming from issues of indigeneity, and really artists whose practice is really ephemeral and lived and is full of tactics. So it's not just post-medium, it's not just a social practice or performative engagement. It's combining anything and everything you can throw at an issue to make some kind of change or to continue a kind of discussion. And in that way, I'm beginning to think that art has always been concerned with rhetoric, right? How do you, through an object, how does an artist communicate to an audience? But now I'm thinking that the rhetoric is becoming more and more the actual substance of the work as a tactic and a media and a strategy. So yeah, education, but that's so broadly defined.
Will that kind of art survive, or is it only for the moment?
It depends what you mean by survive. I think that, in relation to what museums collect, I think museums are changing strategies to find other ways to trace and make sense of that work. But certainly you run a risk of that, it's again about how that work feeds the next statement. So I think it will have implications for who gets into those museums, who gets remembered, but I don't think it's a naive preoccupation. I actually think it is a movement forward.
Thank you everyone for coming out. I think that's it.